Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany, and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I would like to welcome you to our weekly Kaffeepause. Today, we are joined by Deutsche Welle's senior news anchor, Sumi Somaskanda. Sumi, you were our very first guest when we started our Kaffeepause series on March 1st of 2021, and we've spoken a few times since then. Since we first started this new initiative, the Kaffeepause has gotten quite a following and has become a very popular offering by the American Council on Germany. And so I want to thank you for being there when we started. It is great to see you. I'm just sorry that we don't have more positive things to discuss today.
Thanks so much for having me back, Steve. It's always a pleasure to be part of Kaffeepause.
So once again this week, there's really only one topic dominating the news, and that's the war in Ukraine and its impact. Vladimir Putin's hope for a quick victory in Ukraine are gone, and there's concern that he is getting increasingly desperate and that his military is becoming more and more brutal. He brought the war to the edge of NATO and the European Union when Russian forces bombed a military base just a 20-minute drive from the Polish border. The attack over the weekend left 35 people dead and 134 people injured, according to Ukrainian authorities. And this came just as the EU was set to finalize a new package of sanctions today. And as Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is poised to address an emergency session of the Council of Europe. There are also new rounds of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, just at the same time as we're seeing a military escalation. Sumi, you're in Berlin, and I'd like to start by getting a sense from you of what the general mood is in Berlin, given that this conflict is moving closer and closer to the European Union.
Yeah, Steve, I would say people are definitely very anxious. It's a sense you get by the fact that there is nonstop coverage of this war on all media, on all social media. It really is ever present. It is the main topic, I would say, just anecdotally, in conversations, walking by people, speaking in the supermarket and sitting on the street and grabbing a coffee. So I think not only because the war has gotten so close to Berlin, also because of the unpredictability of President Putin and not knowing how this war will continue to expand. It is, let's say, an anxiety-inducing time here, of course, and then there has been the massive outpouring of support for Ukraine as well. The anger with President Putin and the war and the aggression, the invasion, but also this deep sense of solidarity. And again, over the weekend, there were tens of thousands of people out in the streets. It was a very sunny weekend in Berlin. And people were out demonstrating, as they have been now for several weekends. It's not just Berlin, it's also other cities like Munich and Cologne. And they have been taking place really here in Berlin, in the heart of the city, but also in front of the Russian embassy to make a statement. I've also seen a movement, large and small, so among large aid organizations, but also among individuals to help, to pitch in. So just anecdotally, again, among circles of friends and colleagues, there are people who are organizing transports of big trucks with medical supplies, with hygiene articles, with food and water to actually send into Ukraine, to cross from Poland into Ukraine. And there are people showing up at the central train station here in Berlin to help guide some of the people who are arriving. There's been a massive offering of private apartments. So people offering their extra guest room to refugees arriving. And I think we're going to talk a bit more about the refugees. But so you see that this is really a topic that has gripped the country and has people as worried as they are determined, let's say, to stand up for Ukraine.
I mean, it really is an outpouring. And of course, you have your finger on the pulse of that much more than we do over here in the US. We can just sort of follow it in news reports and certainly conversations that I'm able to have with friends and work colleagues. And it really does sound as if this conflict has united the people in a way that no other crisis in recent years has. And I'm thinking specifically about the refugee crisis in 2015 that sort of felt very far away even though it was bringing people to Germany's doorstep and into Germany. And indeed, we will get to the refugees in just a moment. But given what you said about the sort of response in Germany to the war itself and what this war is bringing on in terms of pressures that the country is facing, as you know better than I do, Germany had a major foreign policy pivot just a couple of weeks ago, and the German foreign policy and security policy really changed. In a special session in front of the Bundestag, Olaf Scholz sort of outlined a blueprint where he talked about actually providing arms to Ukraine, increasing the budget of the Bundeswehr by an extra 100 billion euro. He committed to making the 2% of GDP in terms of military expenses, and even said that Germany would go beyond that. And he talked about weaning Germany off of Russian energy sources. How do you gauge the public response to this real shift, sea change in German foreign policy?
Yeah, it really is a sea change that we've witnessed. And just to add a few more points to that, I mean, the fact that Germany is sending defensive weapons to Ukraine to use in combat, despite this long-standing policy against doing so, also stopping the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which we've talked about in Kaffeepause before and speculated over whether this current government would indeed go forward with the pipeline after insisting for years it was an economic project, not a political one, and also just signing up to some very severe sanctions on the European level that target the SWIFT banking system and the Russian central bank, all things that Germany in particular was very hesitant to do. So we've seen it's really been an experience of whiplash, but there has been broad public support for all of these measures. Also for the modernization of the Bundeswehr, for Germany's defense. And you know, it's interesting to note that conversations that I've had with Germans previous to the war starting 2 weeks ago, you would often hear that much needed investment should not be allocated to defense, but rather to climate change, for example, or to updating infrastructure, updating the country's education system, and so on and so forth. And now, really to a T, the people who I speak with agree that there is indeed a need to update Germany's defense, to modernize Germany's defense, and to boost defense spending to make sure that Germany is actually capable of defending its own country and also to be a reliable partner in the NATO alliance. And I just think it's important to point out that no US president, you know, we know other previous US administrations have complained about Germany's reticence in defense spending. It took President Putin and this war to actually move Germany into this position. And, you know, I think if you ask what the public support is at this moment, it has been very broad until this point. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. First, just the brazenness of this invasion. The fact that there is a full-fledged war on European soil. There is also a sense of anger and even betrayal that Germany in particular, and the former Chancellor Angela Merkel, gave President Putin a good deal of rope, if you will, over the past few years, and was a close negotiator in the Minsk agreements, for example. I find that an unfounded sense of betrayal because, quite frankly, if you look at Russia and what President Putin has been doing really over the last 10 years, perhaps we shouldn't have been so surprised by this war. But the fact that there are bombs falling, as you mentioned, Steve, in Lviv, in Western Ukraine, not at all far from Poland, from a NATO partner, from the European Union, I think all of that has contributed to the sense that it really has been a wake up here for many Germans and shifted the sense of European security itself that Europeans have enjoyed for the last 30 years. So I think that has contributed to this sense of support that Olaf Scholz and his government has. Now, if I could just add one thing to that, I think it's important to note that there are calls, particularly from the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, Andrei Melnik, who's been very outspoken and been on on a few talk shows here in Germany to do more. For example, there are some banks, Russian banks, that have not been included in the SWIFT measures on the European level. We know that President Zelensky is calling for a no-fly zone. That's something I've heard echoed from other members of his government. over Ukraine, and an embargo on all Russian gas and oil, which I know we're going to discuss as well. So there are calls to do more, but apparently Olaf Scholz's government has been particularly reluctant. And we saw Anna Vil last night, the Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, saying he actually had a conversation recently with several European leaders asking, why can we not move forward on some of these even stricter measures, tighter sanctions? We need more measures to stop President Putin. And the answer he kept getting was that Germany is dragging its heels. So there is some frustration and support for those calls, particularly for an embargo on Russian oil and gas. So I think that's important to note that although we've seen the sea change, there is a sense as well, particularly among the most outraged and among Ukrainians here in Germany, that the country could be doing far more.
Thank you for that, because I think that provides a tremendous insight. And I guess I have sort of two follow-up questions to kind of the public psyche, if you will. One is, do you see a difference in the generational response to the war? And the reason why I'm asking that is because there are obviously a lot of people who remember the post-World War II period. There are a lot of people who remember sort of the tectonic shift at the fall of the Berlin Wall and the new era that was ushered in when that happened. But there's a younger generation that's come to age since then and has really grown up in a period of peace and prosperity and is now seeing this war unfolding. So one question is kind of the generational makeup in the response. And the other thing, because it has to do with an issue that people were talking about before this conflict, was that there were a lot of Russlandversteher or Russia sympathizers in Germany. And this was one of the points that was frequently leveled at Germany, a criticism that was leveled at Germany for not being a reliable partner. Before this speech that Olaf Scholz gave, have the Russlandversteher been trying to explain this, or have they even understood that this is a crisis of completely new proportions, and that there's really no way of finding a positive argument for what Vladimir Putin is doing?
I'll take the second question first. I would say that the vast majority of Russlandversteher, many of them who are in the SPD, as you know, the Social Democrats have traditionally been considered a relatively Russia-friendly party for a mainstream party. The vast majority of them have lined up behind the government's position. And that means that they have condemned all the steps that Russia has taken and have been extremely critical of President Putin, and have indeed even admitted mistakes in their assessment of the situation and their assessment of what President Putin would do, what was capable of doing. It was interesting to see an interview with the SPD's chief whip in Parliament, Ralf Mützenich, who again has kind of runs along the pacifist stream of the Social Democrats, the SPD, and has been very critical of NATO in general. Indeed, I think right after the election, it talked about whether NATO really was a necessary force in this era. And he has walked back those statements as well and admitted that NATO itself is what is protecting essentially, or preventing all of Europe from being pulled into a war. So this certainly has been seen as a crisis of such dimension that for the vast majority of Russlandversteher, it is one that blows away any sense of, let's say, understanding for Russia. I should say that, of course, among the far-right AfD, there is still a lot of sympathy for the Kremlin, and also, let's say, criticism of the German government's moves as far too escalatory. And also among the CDU in Sachsen, for example, Michael Kretschmer in Sachsen has been somewhat muted in his criticism of Russia, in the sense, not necessarily the criticism of the war, but in criticism of how Germany is pursuing its diplomatic efforts, saying that essentially cutting Russian gas and oil off would be the wrong signal to send at this point. Well, you could argue that the point has far been crossed as to what signal should be sent at this point. But I would add that for the generational rift, it is interesting to see at these protests, you see people young and old turning out in the streets. Really, it's a broad spectrum of society. And of course, the voices of outrage are and anger and sadness, I would say, are most prominent and present among the older generations, those who did witness, as you said, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, and understand what the value of European security and what that infrastructure has meant for the past 30 years. But you have seen also a great deal of support for Ukrainians and for peace among the younger generation. And we had a survey at DW recently among teens, German teens, that showed that they're absolutely terrified of what this war will mean for their own future. And if you think about the fact that many of these young people have grown up with the refugee crisis, with the climate crisis, with COVID, and now this war, they see this as a time of great instability and one that has threatened their own futures. So I would say you wouldn't see that much of a generational difference in how people perceive this war, but perhaps how they perceive their own futures.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You've touched on energy a couple of times, and so I want to take that on head on a little bit. German consumers, of course, have already seen skyrocketing electricity, heating, and gasoline prices. It's having a huge impact on them. Can you talk a little bit about the impact, how the public is responding, and how realistic you think it is that there could be a full-on ban of Russian oil and gas in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, as the case is in the US, the energy prices are absolutely soaring here. That's not just at the pump, but of course for heating apartments and homes and so on and so forth. And that means that there's been a big debate here as well over energy, the structure of how Germany's energy mix is put together, and energy prices. We know that Germany stopped Nord Stream 2, but it gets around 55% of its gas from Russia. And something I didn't realize before this conflict, 50% of its coal that it imports still, because we know that Germany hasn't phased out coal power just yet. Even though the US was able to ban Russian gas and oil imports, that is something that clearly would be very, very difficult for Germany and Europe. And yet at the same time, there have been a lot of calls for Germany to do so, because there is the accusation that Germany is in part bankrolling President Putin's war. That is the criticism that we've seen. And although the government has insisted time and again that all measures on the table, including cutting off Russian oil and gas, they insist that they would not do so to all Russian gas and oil imports, because it would be counterproductive to Germany. And we saw Robert Habeck, who is the economics and climate minister, on Anna Will last night, really quite emotional, talking about the war and talking about the impact on Germany as well. And he said that turning off all Russian oil and gas would essentially weaken Germany's position, because it would bring the economy to a standstill. It would essentially mean no heat for apartments and homes across Germany, would push people into poverty even. And he likened it to kind of cutting off the branch that you're sitting on. It would put Germany in such a weak position in its ability to even counteract Putin and stand strong against Putin. And that's something we've heard echoed by the Union, the CDU, CSU, which is now the largest opposition in the Bundestag. I should say that they are calling for Nord Stream 1 to be turned off. That's something we saw Friedrich Merz, the head of the Union at the moment. He echoed in an interview yesterday, and they say that according to studies by a big scientific institute here, that Germany could manage without the imports from Nord Stream 1. That's something, however, that the Scholz government hasn't yet decided to do, and it's perhaps something that they'll consider. As for the gas prices at the tank, that has become, again, another big political debate, as is the case, as I said, there in the US. And just last week, the minister-president of Saarland, I don't know if you saw this, Steve, but it was kind of a video that went viral here. He did one of these selfie videos ahead in front of a gas station, where he was talking about how the gas prices were crazy, and that it wasn't only affecting low income earners, but also hardworking people, which is in itself somewhat of a strange statement to make. And he got a lot of criticism for that, because in a way, the video in its styling looked a little bit like the videos we've seen from Volodymyr Zelensky. And of course, he came straight out after the video went viral to say there was no connection to Zelensky's videos, but he wanted to bring attention to the fact that average people are struggling. And indeed, people from Markus Söder, the CSU, to Jens Spahn have all been calling for a cap on gas prices so that, people are not struggling so much, essentially to subsidize gas prices. So that is something that we could see actually picked up by the government here. But in the medium term, what it means is that Germany is really moving much faster to change or wean itself off of Russian oil and gas and to try to ramp up its transition to climate-friendly energies as well. But that's something that takes more time than they have at the moment to actually be able to put an embargo on Russian oil and gas. And as for nuclear power, this is my last point on this. It is really, that's another one of these big changes that we've seen in Germany, a big transition in its thinking. We know that all of Germany's nuclear power plants were supposed to go offline this year, and they will, essentially. But the fact that there's even been a debate about whether they should go offline, and that the Greens themselves, Robert Habeck, has said he's willing to consider talking about nuclear power, is pretty flabbergasting for a party that essentially was born out of the anti-nuclear movement, as you know, Steve.
Yeah.
And so that's been interesting. I should say that Robert Habeck said, well, essentially all of these nuclear power plants, they wouldn't be able to remain online because they've already been phased down so much that for safety reasons, they'd have to be shut down for a year and a half and then go back online. So they're not an immediate solution. But again, just adds to some of the changes that we've seen in the foreign energy and security policy here.
So, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Germany was in an energy conundrum even before this crisis took hold in terms of not making the targets for renewables with the Energiewende that was started under Angela Merkel. Robert Habeck, the Minister of Economic Affairs and Energy Policy, who you've talked about, had said we didn't make our targets in the last few years, we won't make our targets in the years ahead. And of course, the crisis with Russia over Ukraine has totally exacerbated this energy conundrum, for lack of a better expression. And it seems to have unleashed sort of a new debate about energy and about energy diversity. And I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more from you about how you think Germany can close the circle in the near term in terms of dealing with its energy needs, because it is really in a bind right now.
I have to say that I haven't figured that one out myself, Steve. I've been reading as many articles as I can get my hands on as to how Germany can actually close that gap and consider weaning itself off of Russian oil and gas. In the medium, or in the short term rather, what it's going to mean is essentially getting energy from sources that will cause Germany to miss its climate goals, as you said, for this year and for next year. And that means receiving gas probably from sources in the Middle East, and also building LNG terminals on the North Sea to receive LNG gas from the US. That's going to be what gets Germany through this next year or so, with the fact that Nord Stream 2 is not going to be up and running, and perhaps Nord Stream 1 could be taken offline. In the medium term, they've talked about upping other sources of energy like hydrogen, for example, using some of the existing pipeline infrastructure to turn to green hydrogen, but all of that takes a bit of time. And so it's going to be a really nervy time in the next 6 to 12 months, really, especially for Robert Habeck's ministry, to figure out exactly what that energy mix is. And he said last night, I mean, it doesn't help much for the current situation, but the writing was on the wall for many years that Germany was far too dependent on one source of energy. The fact that 55% of its oil and gas comes from Russia was clear for some time, and was clear even after 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and should have been a signal at that point that Germany could have made this transition in a far more comfortable way. But I guess the short answer to your question is it's really not clear how it's going to meet that gap in the short and medium term, other than trying to pull together every type of energy that it can get its hands on. And it's also going to mean a bit of, I think it was Robert Habeck who also said in an interview, we're going to have to also grow a bit of tougher skin here in Germany, put on a sweater in the winter, and be used to perhaps reducing our consumption. That, of course, will not add up to the gap that we're discussing, but still, I think it's going to be a change in perspective, and perhaps even a painful one for many Germans for the coming years.
There was also discussion, even in the Scholz speech, of building 2 LNG terminals and buying natural gas from the United States, for example. Do you think that those terminals will now be fast-tracked? Because that takes time too.
Indeed. Bureaucracy is actually, I should have said that up front, bureaucracy is the biggest hurdle to moving forward with some of those new energy mixes that I was mentioning. But apparently one of those LNG terminals is going to be mobile, so it can be actually erected fairly quickly. So that would allow Germany to move forward with receiving that gas from the US relatively quickly. And they're supposedly fast tracking that process for the second LNG terminal as well. So the hope is that that can create a solution in the near future.
So let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the refugee crisis that's unfolding. And you touched on this a little bit earlier as well. What I heard this morning is that the official reports indicate that more than 170,000 refugees from Ukraine have entered Germany already, mostly women and children. The number is likely to be much higher than that because it's not as if people are checked in as they enter the country and asked whether they are refugees or not. You talked a little bit about this outpouring of support, people showing up at main train stations to help refugees who arrive in various cities, people making their apartments available, people supporting the refugees from Ukraine. But how do you see this crisis playing out, both from a policy level, from a governmental level, but also anything more that you'd like to add about the public support?
Yeah, it's interesting to note that the one of the state secretaries here in Berlin yesterday made the point of saying this is really just the tip of the iceberg. The fact that we've seen more than 2 million people flee Ukraine already is a sign that many of them are going to be coming here to Germany. And there are these remnants or these images that remind you of 2015, seeing people showing up at the train stations and so many volunteers there to help them find their way. The numbers are astonishing already. I think over the weekend, it was 4,000 refugees who were placed in temporary shelters in Berlin alone. And Berlin seeing around 1,000 people a day arriving. And they are now starting to redistribute some of the refugees to other cities and other towns because the mayor here, Franziska Giffey, has made clear that although Berlin is doing what it can to support the refugees who have been arriving, Berlin will certainly need help. It cannot house so many people so quickly and provide, basic supplies and so on and so forth so quickly over the next, coming weeks. They are also re-erecting some of the infrastructure that reminds me of 2015, so big registration tents. There were some, mistakes made in the early days. For example, that private people could come to the train station and offer their private homes, which is on the one hand, of course, an incredibly generous offer, but it also presents some security issues if you have often young, vulnerable women arriving with their children from Ukraine. It was pointed out that there needs to be some sort of registration system to know where they're headed and where they're being housed and to make sure that they truly are safe, that no one's taking advantage of the situation. All of that kind of got lost in the shuffle in the first few days. And you saw, despite all of the signs that there was going to be an influx of refugees, that yeah, indeed, Berlin wasn't really that well prepared. They're now developing an app. The interior minister was talking about an app that's being developed that's similar to the one that Poland is using that will register all Ukrainian refugees. They don't have to apply for asylum right away to receive all of the benefits that they need and their basic needs covered. And they are going to be distributed essentially throughout the country. And you already see now the municipalities and cities turning to the federal government and saying, we cannot deal with this on our own. And the Interior Minister, Nancy Faeser, said in an interview yesterday, she didn't fully promise, but essentially said the government is, of course, going to step in and help the cities and communities and towns to deal with the logistical and the financial burden, really, of making sure so many people have shelter, that they have their basic needs, their medical needs met, and so on and so forth. And it's been remarkable to see in such a short amount of time, Berlin witnessing yet again another refugee crisis, and also the difference in the way that it's covered, which I know, Steve, you probably talked about here on Kaffeepause before, and how Ukrainian refugees are seen versus how some of the refugees coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it has been a dizzying time over the last week here in Berlin to see so many people arriving. And I've already gotten requests to help out journalists who are coming from Kiev, and, you know, hand some clothes off to a colleague's friend. And it really has reached kind of everyone, I could say.
It seems, I mean, it seems really, even from what you said at the outset, as if this is really touching almost everybody in German society. It was interesting to hear you talk about, you know, the government response from the city-state level, or from the state level, but also from the federal level. One person who you didn't mention, I think, was Volker Wissing, the transportation minister, who also has gone on record as saying we need to develop a distribution mechanism so that all of Germany is involved in sort of absorbing refugees, and that this would start already from where those refugees are picked up in places like Poland, or wherever they arrive in Europe, and not, you know, that they come to Berlin, that they all come to Berlin and then are distributed from there. So it seems as if the federal government is really trying to figure out how the country can, you know, deal with this onslaught of people. And as you said, you know, we have talked a little bit about it, but not in depth, that these refugees are being received in a very different way from the refugees who were received in 2015 and 2016. In light of our time, there are a couple of other topics that I really want to get to, and one that relates to refugees is the fact that Olaf Scholz is going to be in Ankara today. He's probably already in Ankara, and he will be meeting with President Erdogan. They'll have a press conference after their meeting. Of course, Turkey is an incredibly important country when it comes to managing streams of refugees, and has been since 2015. But it's also important to point out that although Turkey is a NATO member and has had aspirations to join the European Union in the past, it's not participating in key parts of the sanctions regime that many countries are leveling against Russia. And so I'd maybe like to start and hear from you about what we might expect from these talks between Olaf Scholz and President Erdogan, and what you think that they'll focus on. Undoubtedly, the war in Ukraine, and perhaps the role that diplomacy can play.
Yeah, indeed. And this is the second kind of effort from Turkey, because just last week it was in Antalya that the Turkish foreign minister was the one who hosted those talks between the Ukrainian and Russian foreign ministers that, albeit didn't lead to a breakthrough, were still the first step. Turkey has taken on an interesting role here, excuse me, as many people have pointed to perhaps Israel also being able to play, because Turkey is a NATO member, but is seen in many ways as a friend of Russia, or in some fields, a partner of Russia. It's seen as a player who can perhaps actually bring even President Putin to the table. And that is why Germany has been open to turning to Turkey as a mediator in this crisis. And, you know, it's interesting because, as you said, Turkey's been instrumental in controlling refugee flows, particularly the refugees who were arriving in 2015 and 2016. We know that Germany and Europe reached the refugee agreement with Turkey. But at the same time, that's always been a difficult partnership because of the frustration and anger over Turkey's backsliding on democratic standards and its jailing of journalists and opposition members. And although some of those, including German citizens, and although many of those have been released, there is a hesitancy to develop close partnerships with Turkey on many of these issues. However, that being said, Germany, and Lars Klingbeil has said this, who's the party head of the SPD, has said this many times, any effort that could perhaps bring any sort of avenue or open up any sort of avenue towards peace is one that we should welcome. And I think that's where Olaf Scholz today is really going to be pressing President Erdogan, is to ask him to reach out directly to President Putin, to appeal to him, to bring him to the table, to introduce a ceasefire at the very least. One that can hold for a couple of days to allow the humanitarian situation to be addressed and allows more civilians to leave some of the more besieged areas. That is something that I think that Olaf Scholz and his government are really hoping that Turkey can provide. How realistic is it that Turkey can do so? Well, I think its influence with Russia only goes so far. it certainly would be a much more welcome signal and more important signal if China were to be the mediator here, because we know that China has far more sway than Turkey in this situation. But like I said, the fact that 2 of these diplomatic efforts are now being hosted by Turkey is a sign that it does have a role to play. So I think that's going to be the main message they'll be discussing today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I mean, of course, China is a whole other topic,
Yeah.
but I think I'll leave that on the sidelines for now, because I wanted to sort of, as we start to draw to a close, to come back to Germany. I am disappointed sort of each day when I check in with German news to hear that there is an increase in COVID cases, and that's happening against the backdrop of this unfolding crisis. And of course, one of the news reports that I saw over the weekend was that there was a real likelihood that COVID will spread even more because of this crisis, because particularly when you think about refugees gathering, trying to find safe spaces, they are not necessarily taking the health precautions that one would need to, because they're trying to protect themselves. And indeed, in Germany, we're seeing a day by day increase in cases, according to the Robert Koch Institute. And COVID is no longer in the headlines because the war in Ukraine is taking all the oxygen. So very briefly, what's the latest on Germany's pandemic response, and where do things stand?
The picture doesn't look good. Germany, I think, has the highest COVID numbers right now in Europe, hit another record last week. And the health minister, Karl Lauterbach, said essentially the impact of COVID-19 has reached a critical level again. And he said, Omicron is a variant that we all consider to be mild, but there are still 200 people dying a day. And despite all of those warnings, and perhaps inexplicably, and perhaps because the government has also been distracted by this war, but I think also because of the public pressure to do so, they are still moving forward with loosening restrictions in a step-by-step manner until March 20th. And that means the restrictions on how many people can gather at once, the types of restrictions for entering a restaurant will be loosened a bit. The places where you're required to wear a mask, you'll still be required to wear a mask in public transport and in trains and such, but in many places, a lot of those restrictions are going to be loosened, despite the numbers that we're seeing right now. And state governments can still, if they have a hotspot, for example, they can still decide to impose severe restrictions again. But it looks at this point very unlikely that many of the states will do so, not least because nobody's really paying attention to COVID, except for perhaps Karl Lauterbach. He is appealing to those states to look at their own situations and their own hotspots and address them. But I'd say the last point on that is there was a hope that there would be a big uptick in vaccinations rather, because Germany had lagged behind because of the introduction of Novavax, which is based on conventional technology and not an mRNA vaccine. And that hasn't happened either. So I think there's a lot of concern for the unvaccinated and what this latest wave is going to mean for them, and an understanding that it could be another difficult wave in the future, because that's what we're witnessing right now. So essentially not very good news, Steve.
Well, as one of my colleagues pointed out, and this actually ties some of these themes together kind of nicely, Ukrainians are not vaccinated to the same levels as many people in Germany are. And so I guess one question that I have for you, given this sort of influx of refugees, is whether there are any measures in place to vaccinate people as they come in, to try to sort of reduce the risk of a new wave coming from the outside, as well as what's already going on in the country.
That's an interesting question. I haven't seen anything on that front here yet. From what I've seen, they are struggling simply to build a system to make sure that everyone is registered properly, and also to make sure that the tents that are set up for registration and the initial accommodations are all COVID safe, let's say. But I haven't seen anything about the possibility of providing vaccinations to many of the refugees who are arriving. I think that'd be an interesting proposal, however, and perhaps one that might come to light in the coming days as the numbers of people arriving continue to grow.
So lastly, this week marks the end of the first 100 days of Chancellor Scholz and his Ampel Regierung in Berlin. I think it was clear to all of us, I think we even talked about it, that this new government was going to have a steep learning curve.
Yeah.
And it has certainly had a trial by fire in terms of the war in Ukraine, really making them come up to speed quickly. Ukraine has dominated the agenda in every sense, in every ministry, but in a couple of sentences perhaps, what are some of the other issues that the new government has been working on since coming into office that have not been in the limelight as much as foreign and security and energy policy have been?
They made climate change and digitalization two of the biggest priorities at the start of their time in office, if you will. And there have been a few pieces of progress, that the expansion of wind farms, for example, that Robert Habeck has announced. Volker Wissing, who you mentioned, as well as the transport minister and digital minister, has announced a few new initiatives to modernize digital infrastructure and to modernize transport and to help support Deutsche Bahn, the railway, German railway as well. We saw that one of the main election campaign pieces of Olaf Scholz's campaign, the 12 euro minimum wage was announced. So that was something that they were able to push through. But quite frankly, I think it's been a pretty difficult start for the coalition. They could not push through, or could not even really come to an agreement on a vaccine mandate. That was one that took several rounds of debate. There was, before the war started, a lot of debate over who's actually doing foreign policy. Is it the foreign minister or the chancellor? And some bickering between the two parties, the Social Democrats and the Greens, over that. Chris and Linda pushing back on fiscal reforms on the European level, despite previous to the election talking about the need, or right after being elected rather, the need to be a bit more flexible on fiscal rules. So it was kind of an underwhelming start for this Ampel, this traffic light coalition. And I think the biggest problem was that Olaf Scholz was largely absent. He was not really seen in the public eye, and there was all these kind of "Where's Waldo" graphic images of searching for Olaf Scholz and where he's gone, and a lot of questions about his leadership. He's someone, my sense, who takes a bit of time to step into the role, and perhaps we'll see more from him and his coalition's agenda going forward. But my sense is that much of that has been obviously derailed by the war, and that will also be a setback for some of those important goals on climate change and digitalization.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as recently as 3 weeks ago or so, the sort of levels of support in official polls was very low. Scholz and the government were not well received by the public. Have those numbers changed? Have they gone up in light of sort of a more forward-leaning, more robust response to the Ukraine crisis?
They have. They've ticked up slightly, so that the SPD is around the level right now that they were on election night, and that the CDU has fallen a bit slightly. Of course, Olaf Scholz, with his speech in the Bundestag that you mentioned, talking about a Zeitenwende, gave him an important platform, and there's a lot of solidarity behind the government and the measures it's taking. So that's certainly been a boon and a help. We have to see if that lasts, as this war drags on. And there is an election coming up towards the end of the month in Saarland, which will be interesting to watch. The CDU there is trailing behind the SPD as well. So could be another strong showing for the SPD to unseat the CDU there.
Well, Sumi, as ever, it is great to talk with you. We have covered a lot of ground. We've talked about a range of topics, and I really appreciate your taking the time, but also your willingness to address sort of a full bandwidth of topics and issues. I've learned a lot. I think our viewers have as well, judging from some of the comments in the chat. People thought that this was a great discussion. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a really interesting discussion, and as I said at the beginning, I always enjoy it.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Stay well, stay healthy, and good luck dealing with all of the things that you have on your plate as well.
Thank you, Steve, and have a good day to everyone.